studies have shown the very high level of dependency that we have upon having healthy ecosystems in order to thrive economically and in terms of our health and livelihoods and well-being. And whatever it is that we end up using today in terms of these natural capital services will be depleted into the future. And so there is really a great need to try and find ways to respond to both the biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis. Today we'll be speaking much more about biodiversity and less about climate, but of course they're interrelated. We have some good tools in the toolbox for dealing with biodiversity loss. Some of the issues that we'll be talking through today include important elements of comprehensive planning, carrying out impact assessments for development activities. You'll hear much more about that as we go through this morning. We're also benefiting from increased knowledge and awareness around targeted conservation actions and the need for policies to move forward. One of the tools that we've been using a lot over the past couple of decades is the mitigation hierarchy. There will be quite an in-depth discussion about how that's applied and why that's important in this context, so I won't go into it now, but I will acknowledge that this has been developed over the past 15 or 20 years quite extensively through a number of efforts, including the Business and Biodiversity Offset Program, which was hosted by Forest Trends. And there's a new IUCN thematic group that Martine will talk about a little bit later on that is also a space for learning and sharing of information. IUCN saw the need to establish clarity in terms of what are biodiversity offsets and how should they be acceptable, how should they not be used, and as part of a long-term consultation process came up with a policy that was approved by IUCN's members in 2016, and we've been working since then in terms of documenting around the globe what are some of the policies that already are in existence in different countries regarding the application of the mitigation hierarchy. Of course, well, it was meant to be 2020, but things got slightly delayed due to the pandemic. But 2021 is really, has been considered for some time now to be a super year for biodiversity. And that's because there are a series of very important global meetings that should help lay down the guidance and the frameworks for how we're going to move forward in terms of safeguarding our natural resources. A couple of the events in that trajectory include the IUCN World Conservation Congress, which will be happening this September, both virtually as well as in person in Marseille, in France. For example, one of the resolutions that comes out of that process is looking at how to apply the mitigation hierarchy to the broader post-2020 conventional biological diversity framework. Speaking of that, there will be a meeting in October, the Conference of the Parties, looking at the CBD in China, where the frameworks and the approaches for how we propose to move forward globally should be defined and accepted. And also importantly, in bringing us back to the earlier discussions on climate change, I'm sure you all know that there's a very important meeting regarding the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, at the end of 2021. So there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of things happening, and the work that we're discussing here today both feeds into that process as well as takes advantage of the new thoughts and processes moving forward. With that, I'll turn it over to Martine. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Steve and Fabien, for the really great introduction. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Eastern Australia on the traditional lands of the Yagara people, and I acknowledge their custodianship of the land for millennia, which has been rather more successful than what we've done to it in the last couple of hundred years. And those sorts of ecological degradation syndromes that we see around the world are, are pretty common and they're pretty well recognized. And some of the most obvious and direct drivers of that degradation are the direct transformations that we as humans make to the landscape. So infrastructure development, industry development projects that have direct impacts like clearing habitat, opening up roads and impacting on biodiversity. And of course, we're faced with a need for some development, and there's always going to be a situation where there's some conflicts between even the best designed development and biodiversity conservation. And so today we're really here to talk about, well, how do we best manage these conflicts in such a way that we can still achieve our biodiversity goals? Now, the positive thing, I guess, about the impacts of things like infrastructure development projects is that they are a very direct and controlled type of impact. They're not as diffuse and difficult to pin down as things like invasive species or a disease that's loose in the ecosystem. They are things we make very deliberate decisions about. So we have the opportunity to do them better. And I think probably maybe almost everybody on the call is very familiar in this meeting is familiar with the mitigation hierarchy, but just in case to run you through it, this is the commonest tool that we use as an overarching guide to how to do development better and account for those impacts on biodiversity in such a way that we can ultimately achieve a known net loss outcome, which we're going to be talking about today. So the idea being that, you know, on the far left of the graph, we might be planning some sort of a development project that has a biodiversity impact. Perhaps it's impacting on some ecosystems, forest ecosystems, some particular species that inhabit those ecosystems. So we can account for that. And then we apply the mitigation hierarchy, the first and most important step being to try to avoid those impacts on biodiversity, such as by relocating the project to an area where it might have less impacts, and minimizing impacts in the site where it is done by through best practice implementation of controls. And then, of course, restoring where we can, if there is an impact that may only be temporary, that we can repair on site. But even after we've done all of these things and followed the mitigation hierarchy as strictly as we can, there's often still some residual impact on biodiversity. And of course, the accumulation of many even small residual impacts is what is driving that ongoing depletion of biodiversity across the planet. And so this is where the final step of the mitigation comes in, and that's the compensatory component, offsetting, where we do something beneficial off-site for that same biodiversity, so that same type of forest or that same species, to generate an increase, a benefit, so maybe an increase in population, or protect that habitat somewhere else. The idea being that the benefit off-site counterbalances the loss on-site, so that we have at least a known net loss outcome and ideally a net gain. So that sounds great, and we end up with offsetting being a really important part then of all of these net outcome claims. So whenever you hear people talking about no net loss or net gain, that implies that there is some counterbalancing going on, something like offsetting. The problem is, though, that what we might hear when we hear the idea of no net loss, it tends to imply that that means, okay, so there's no decline then in biodiversity over time. And that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's often not the case with offsetting. So offsetting, as it's currently done, is actually not very well aligned. It's not designed to be aligned with the achievement of the targets, the actual biodiversity goals that we have, the outcomes we want to see. So to just illustrate that a little bit further, if we imagine an offset exchange involves two different sites. We have one site where we're doing a negative impact on biodiversity. So I'm here in Australia, let's use the koala as an example. So we've got some koala habitat at a site, and there's some housing development that's going to go in, and some of that koala habitat is going to be lost over time from that development. Then over at another site, we're going to do something beneficial so that we can counterbalance that loss and say we've achieved no net loss. And a really common thing to do at the offset site is to find some koala habitat somewhere else and protect it. And that might be quite a good thing to do and generate quite a large benefit if, without protecting that habitat, it would otherwise have been lost. So, you know, the difference in that middle graph between the solid line and the dotted line is like the difference between what happens if we do the offset and if we don't do the offset. So we might end up achieving a benefit through that protection. But of course, the sum of these two sites is still a net outcome of there being less habitat after the development than before. It's just that we've saved some from being lost and lost some others. So whenever we exchange, protecting and maintaining existing biodiversity for losing biodiversity somewhere else, there's always going to be less biodiversity across those sites afterwards than before. And of course, when we hear about big international goals of no net loss or big national ideas like biodiversity net gain, that's not the sort of outcome we really mean, is it? So these sorts of outcomes are really not well aligned with conservation targets, especially if we're talking about species that are already threatened, because these are species that we agree there's already too small a population of. So maintaining some sort of decline is not really the outcome we're after. And another way to illustrate this is to think about offsetting that involves protecting habitat in exchange for clearing other habitat. If you start on the left here with, an area of forest, the yellow indicates some sort of development that has gone in and removed the forest, and then the darker green are the patches we might protect. So that's a 2-to-1 ratio of protection to loss. That sounds pretty good. But of course, what it means is that if you lose 1 unit of habitat in exchange for not losing 2 other units, you end up with losing 1/3 of the remaining habitat once everything is either gone or protected. And so the ratio of protection to habitat loss essentially sets the amount of decline that we're willing to go down to. And that's not always what we actually want to be doing for biodiversity. Drawing down our biodiversity even further than it is now is sometimes not what we want. So this is where the work of a working group that I was lucky enough to be involved with over recent years has been focusing on, and this is only about half the group you can see here, about 26 people. We worked on a series of issues around how to improve offsetting, but one of the big ones was how can we get around this problem? How can we design offsets that actually are aiming to achieve a net outcome that is consistent with conservation targets? So how do we do ecological compensation in a way that we can do actions that are beneficial for the species that we are impacting to such a point that we're actually keeping them on track to recovery if we have a target of recovery, or making sure we don't continually draw down that biodiversity by just protecting some of it and clearing the rest. And the other point is, of course, that we wanted to find a way to make a no net loss outcome really be what it sounds like, which is, not less biodiversity after than before. So it's also about transparency and communication. And the essence of the idea, which is we're going to go through in more detail in a little video in a minute, so I won't labour it, but essentially you start by working out where you want to get to. So you start with your destination. What is the target outcome for the particular type of biodiversity that we're considering? So for each species, a species that is already threatened, you may actually have a target outcome of, recovery. There may be an ecosystem you don't want to deplete any further, for example. And so coming up with those targets is a big part of the discussion. So then we work out, okay, so if we're going to have an impact on one of these ecosystems, for example, how much of this ecosystem is left relative to how much we want to have left? Are we below where we want to be? Are we about at the level that we don't want to deplete further? Or is this something really widespread and we can live with a little further loss as long as we manage it? That gives us the trajectory that we want to see. So the terminology is a bit different here. A genuine net gain, meaning a genuine increase. No net loss, meaning no change over time. Or a managed net loss, which is, sure, there will be a drawdown, but we're managing it so that it doesn't dip below a particular threshold. This information then tells you what sorts of actions are acceptable. So for all cases, you probably need to protect some existing habitat and manage it and maintain it. But if you want to claim that you're achieving a real net gain or no net loss outcome, you also have to do improvement work. So restoration, weed removal, improving the condition of habitat, planting trees, that sort of thing, or actions that increase the population of a species rather than just maintain it in exchange for a loss. And we have a spreadsheet that shows how you can calculate how much of that gain you need to achieve. So if we go back to our koala example, if we have a target of not having any less koala habitat than we have now, and that is in fact a recent target established by the Queensland government, it means we have to start putting the trees back in the ground, not just protecting other trees that are already in the ground. So I think I'm just going to skip over this because I suspect I'm taking a little bit too long. We can talk about that in the breakout groups. But although that working group I mentioned has wrapped up its work, a lot of us felt, and many of the members had been involved in some of those initiatives that Steve mentioned before in terms of the biodiversity, business and biodiversity offsets program, and also the IUCN policy development and other projects. And we felt that it was really important to maintain that community of practice. And so sitting within the Commission on Ecosystem Management now in the IUCN is a new thematic group. And I'd really like to encourage people to go and have a look at the website, learn a bit about it. And if you're interested, please feel free to sign up. All you need to do is sign up as a member, apply to be a member of the Commission on Ecosystem Management through the Commission's portal. And you can indicate our group as one of interest, and then you'll get all the information about what we do. And these are all the things we hope to do, some of which was started, some of which are still getting off the ground. We just launched about middle of last year. So, you know, we want to be, you know, a collection of expertise for advice on best practice implementation of the mitigation hierarchy. And we want to do some pieces of work around finding out what actually works well in the world of compensation and offsetting and what doesn't. We want to support the uptake of these sorts of target-focused approaches to impact mitigation and offsetting, aligning with conservation targets. Develop and share decision support tools, research and guidance and training material, and to just generally as a community share resources and case studies and experience with the mitigation hierarchy in general. So I'll leave it there. Hand back to Fabien. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you, Martine. That was a speedy presentation of target-based compensation, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss this in breakout groups and to guide you in that process. We've listed a few points of discussion. First, you know, everyone's understanding of no net loss and net gain, going back to this ambiguity that Martine presented, how that then connects with the targets, and hopefully we can get some practical discussions for people's regions or countries in terms of how this might actually apply to their specific circumstances. So we should discuss this in the upcoming breakout groups. But quickly, before we do that, we will be showing you a short video to explain this again, and then you will be automatically distributed between the breakout groups. Okay, so I guess everyone should be back in the plenary. And so we hope you had some interesting discussions in the breakout groups. What we hope now is to get some feedback from each group. So perhaps I will start with the discussion that we had. So we had a limited group of people, but with two very contrasting experiences of how target-based ecological compensation could play out. The first example is from the United Kingdom, where Helen told us that there was a regulatory obligation to achieve a plus 10% net gain of biodiversity for development projects in the UK, and that this was consistent with the situation of biodiversity in the UK, which is quite degraded, but that as a business, it was challenging to know what to do with this 10% requirement, and that there was actually limited guidance available as to where the most effective use of the offsetting resource could be made. And this is also a testimony to the fact that the plus 10% net gain goal is not, particularly aligned or doesn't have any original consistency anyway with biodiversity goals set at the national level, such as having 10%, 30%, sorry, of the UK under protection by 2030, or even local government goals, where local governments can have spatial planning policies and objectives in terms of corridors and areas of natural interest, but that alignment hasn't happened yet. But it would be very useful for developers to know how best to offset their impacts to contribute to those goals. So that's an interesting situation from the UK. At the other extreme, we spoke about the Republic of Congo, where Emily has been working for several years. And so the Republic of Congo has still a large extent of rainforest with a low rate of deforestation, but some projects nevertheless, such as mining projects that lead to clearing of this forest. And the usual offsetting requirement in that context, when developers voluntarily engage in such offsetting, is to actually fund either existing but underfunded protected areas, or to establish new protected areas on existing high-value habitat. And so this is something that leads to an absolute net loss, as we saw in the video. And so we discussed whether or not it would be feasible for the government to actually think about how it could translate its forest retention goals that it might have either under the Biodiversity Convention or the Climate Convention into an offsetting requirement for developers. Well, certainly the opportunity is there, but there was a risk which was interesting, which is that current deforestation rates are low, at least in the northern part of the country, and actually getting the government to think about how much it would accept to lose might be riskier for biodiversity than the business as usual scenario. And so that was an interesting twist to the conversation. And I'll stop here to give the floor to group two.
So in group two, we had experiences from 3 different countries, so France, Mozambique, and South Africa. Across the board, there were sort of general thoughts on how targets can be considered. So it's important that they're developed at the policy level. They can't be developed by a project, obviously. And when you're considering progress towards targets, national targets, you also need to have some form of national coordination mechanism or national accounting mechanism, so that you can see where, what's happening. So that's an important point. And also, obviously, when you're setting targets, you don't need perfect data. Having good data is sufficient for developing things like key biodiversity area or other spatial analyses. In Mozambique, for example, there are some targets at national level, and the aim is to, as the policy on mitigation is still being developed, the aim is to try and build capacity by focusing on compensation in protected areas. As generally across the country, the resources and capacity are constrained. So this allows you to test models, test mechanisms for implementing offsets. And over time, obviously, that will inform policy and also build capacity generally, which seems a logical approach and sensible. Co-management is required, so you're not just working solely with the government or solely with consultants or an NGO to develop the mechanism, so you are building national capacity. In South Africa, there is a mitigation approach that's probably, you could say it's world leading in some respects of the way that the policy has been developed. It's very innovative, and it is perhaps the first country which I think has developed appropriate national target-based mitigation. And I won't go into the detail as it's quite complex, but basically the more threatened site biodiversity requires very high multipliers of gains required, for example, if it's an endangered ecosystem. Whereas conversely, in lower importance sites, in dry lands or areas with other degraded biodiversity, you don't need necessarily to even do compensation. So it drives you to avoid the most important sites. And that's a very sort of helpful approach to improving avoidance. In the more complex sites with compensation, it might be difficult for a developer to understand how compensation or offsets are calculated, and also if they change over time with modifying targets. So it's important to have good communication about these sorts of things. So there are many other points, but that's a brief summary of what we discussed.
Thank you. I think Martine is, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm terrible at these report backs because I get so involved in the discussions that I forget to sort of take some step back overview. But it was a great discussion because we had people with familiarity with working with businesses, people working with financiers, people working with governments and with NGOs. So we sort of had all those different players, all of whom are really important in this world. And so I guess also veered badly off track perhaps with the questions and didn't get through them all. But it was, you know, some of the feedback, Daniela was saying that one of the useful things about the target-based approach is that it's an opportunity to help improve accountability. And I was saying, I think that's a good way of looking at it because it helps build some sort of, I think we all probably have experiences of offsets that have been said to have been done, which we doubt are likely to have had much of a counterbalancing effect, or may not have been like for like and so on. So the opportunity to have clear targets, setting the outcomes required. And, you know, you should then be able to look across the impact and the offset sites and really see that there is more biodiversity after than before. That's a really difficult thing to do if you're relying on measuring a gain against an unobserved counterfactual, which is what we do for averted loss offsetting. There was also, yes, so Marcelo was saying, really good point that actually there's a lot of similarities or a lot of alignment conceptually with the target-based approach and the science-based targets network and its work. Which is essentially about trying to work out where we need to get to, then dividing up responsibility among those who are participating in something such as potentially having an impact through their supply chains or whatever. And yeah, and I completely agree. And the IMEC group is connected through to the science-based targets work because of that really clear conceptual alignment. So to me, that's very much the way that thinking about targets and individual responsibility is the way we link everything through from global goals for biodiversity through to national goals, through to individual company behaviour, through to individual responses to impacts at individual sites. So I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Also, Beatrice was talking about a set of new standards on biodiversity and ecosystems through the European Investment Bank, which I was really interested to hear about. It talks about no net loss. And sorry, putting Beatrice on the spot, we were trying to work out, oh, what does it say about no net loss? It's probably pretty high level. What do we think that then means if they require, you know, no net loss? Do we think it means the sort of no net loss we're talking about, or the sort of no net loss that's common under typical offset policies? Do we think it means like for like or not? So I'm really interested to see a little bit about that consultation process. So hoping to connect. I don't know, Beatrice, if that's an open consultation process on that standard, but feel free to pop the link in the chat if there is one. Sorry, I should have checked with that before I just said that in plenary, but there you go. Yeah, Nasiba was talking about the work in Mozambique, which is a great example of a jurisdiction that's taken on board these ideas around target-based approaches. The fact that this is that's where we sort of came back to the issue of avoidance and the critical no-go areas that are so important. And we were saying how, you know, the requirement to achieve no net loss implies in an absolute sense implies that if you can't regenerate or you can't restore something, then you essentially can't impact it if you also want no net loss. So it sort of helps you work out where no net loss occurs. And I mean, the fact that that Mozambique is implementing this, it sort of shows the way that you can put together a national pathway to implementing a target-based approach with really limited data. But if there's enough will and there's a clear pathway, which I think has been really interesting to follow the Mozambican process, you know, there's no reason why this can't happen, as I think Fabien was saying, with some data. It doesn't have to be perfect data. Some data is enough. One example was the Brazil case study. So we were talking about the forest code in Brazil and how they've also sort of developed a mechanism that starts with the target. So, you know, 80% of Amazonas or 20% of Atlantic forest to be retained. And then the mechanism for achieving that, we work back from there. And that's what we're trying to do with target-based approaches. I'd better stop. Sorry.
Jeremy?
Thank you, Fabien.
Yeah.
Are we good for time? I won't take much time here.
Well, yeah, please be quick.
Okay, thanks. I'm Jeremy Simmons. I'm from the University of Queensland. I will be quick. Our group, it was very fortunate for me. I was with 4 friends from France, so it was really informative for me to learn about France and the French system and the application of the mitigation hierarchy and offsetting. The topic of avoidance came up. Martine's mentioned that the primacy of avoiding impacts in the first place. We talked about the potential disconnects between international agreements like the CBD post-2020 framework and how they get translated to outcomes-based national or jurisdictional targets. This target-based approach is really fundamentally founded on having clear targets to which compensation can be directed. So there's some work to do there and a lot of thinking. A really interesting pragmatic point came up. Target-based compensation really puts the spotlight on restoration and improvement actions. There needs to be sufficient land available in order to undertake those sorts of actions. And so that's a really important consideration when designing and implementing any offsets policy, but I suppose one that particularly focuses on taking land that's in a degraded state or is in under some other land use and converting it back to some sort of natural or semi-natural state as an offset. So that was a really cool, a very important practical point for thinking about how to implement this approach. I'll leave it there. I really want to thank the 4 participants in the breakout group for it. It was a really interesting discussion.
Sorry, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for everyone who was involved in those discussions. I understand that we now have a drawing that will be shared with us that summarizes those discussions.
Yes, give me a few seconds. I'm trying to get it to show up on the screen, and it should be here. Yes, I will now share my screen with you, and there you go. Normally, we should be seeing this. Yes.
Are you going to explain this to us, or is it
you
supposed to make sense?
I can do this for you. So we started with the problem on the left, the mass extinction and the opportunities we have around industries and infrastructure, where we can go to offsetting and preferably target-based compensations. And I took up the idea of the koala a little bit, so he keeps telling us how to go. Some examples and yeah, what more can I say?
It's really good.
Getting the,
I love it.
Thanks. Getting the starting point and work on how to get there, and then some ideas around human possibilities in recreating pristine ecosystems. Voila. Feel free to have a look or take a screenshot. I will also send this to you afterwards.
Okay, great. No, thank you. It's fantastic. And so the next step is actually we would like Hugo to explain how he's led some work trying to bring countries to apply this mitigation hierarchy, to apply it better and to align it with conservation goals. So Hugo, you should have your yes. So go ahead. So it's 5 minutes, and then we'll be able to close the session.
I'll keep this short. So I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, and together with many of my colleagues on this session, notably Fabien QUETIER and other colleagues at Biotope and the University of Queensland, Biofund, Guinea Ecological. This project is a partnership, and we've already had the first phase for up to 2020, working in several countries across Africa. And the aim of the project is to reconcile development, economic development and conservation objectives by contributing to the development and implementation of policies aimed at no net loss, net gain. And increasingly, we're hoping to move this towards the achievement of national biodiversity targets, as we've been discussing. The 4 countries we're working in are Guinea, Uganda, Mozambique and Madagascar, and we're rolling it out now in Myanmar and Laos. We're very kindly supported by the Agence Française de Développement and the Fonds Français pour l'Environnement Mondial. Their support has been hugely helpful in developing some of the thinking about how we do our work and rolling it out with our partners across the different countries where we're active. So the first and perhaps the most important objective of this is to look at how biodiversity risk is framed and regulated. And I have to say, Peter Jan's graphic actually captured a lot of our objectives, so well done him. So we're supporting and assisting governments in the establishment of governance systems and policies to guide implementation of the mitigation hierarchy, which also supports national biodiversity objectives. And this is a really fundamental point, setting the scene, framing what people are required to do, and building the capacity of, or building the understanding within government about what good policy might be. The second objective is looking at where biodiversity impacts should be avoided and offset if necessary, and fundamentally, really, how do you measure biodiversity? That's a really difficult question because biodiversity is infinitely complex. So what we're doing is we're developing tools and guidance for spatial planning and offsets implementation to help avoid, mitigate and offset impacts on priority biodiversity, and working with national stakeholders to make progress towards national biodiversity objectives. Thirdly, and perhaps one of the more complex approaches, is to work out what models and systems are necessary for effective financing and implementation of offsets. So it's very important to test and develop innovative models and the sort of guidance and protocols required for implementing the offsets, and doing this obviously in partnership with the developers, with the public sector and the government in both policy and in industry sectors, civil society and on-the-ground conservationists. And this is each country will have their own systems and their own opportunities, and so you have to sort of test things at a national level. And fourthly, obviously, you have to work out which sectors and institutions require support to improve their effectiveness in applying policy. So we're working with governments, civil society, banks, businesses, etc., to help understand and apply the mitigation hierarchy. And then there's a fundamental principle across the whole of our work, in that there is a risk that biodiversity offsets can negatively impact people, through restrictions to livelihoods and loss of access to biodiversity. So it's very important that social impacts are adequately considered for the development project, as well as through offsets, and approaches such as FPIC and planning for any resettlement or livelihood restoration is integrated into what you're doing. So overall, the project aims to build on the investment in policy and data to move towards implementation, and we want to expand what we're doing overall to the new countries within the project. using our lessons learned from the first phase to roll this out, and then increase the sharing of information through events such as this, through a new website, which we'll be rolling out at the end of the month. So stay in touch, and general global outreach through webinars, through the IMEC IUCN group. And that's a large part of what we're doing. And I will now hand back to Fabien. Thank you.
Well, I think that was it. So I thank you to all the participants. Hopefully this was interesting and enlightening, and you'll be able to access the presentation and some of the links that was shared in the presentation and also in the chat to continue on your journey on this topic. We have a few minutes if people have some burning questions or key things they would like to raise. We were kindly given some extra minutes by the organizers. So put your hand up if if you want to raise a particular issue, and if not, we are happy to disconnect. No one's putting their hand up. Everything was crystal clear. Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to close off the session. Or maybe the organizers are doing that. I don't know. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, and stay in touch.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you. Do you want to stay extra minutes, guys?
To hang out with you.
I
don't know.
Lunch, maybe?